Um, Prior to my involvement with the steam crew, I had worked at the Georgetown Loop, at the Durango and Silverton as a carman, later as a machinist, and I got sent down there with the number 40. It's a 280 up at Georgetown Loop. It's from the Federal Railways of Guatemala. It's a beautiful 280, and it needed to be rebuilt. And so I went down there at the request of the Ashbys to help disassemble that locomotive. Well, that was right about the time they were starting to rebuild the 482. And they didn't have enough people because they were focusing on the 482, so they needed the Georgetown Loop guys to come down there. Well, I think Lindsay Ashby knew that when I sent Ed down to Durango, he wasn't coming back. And that's more or less what happened. You know, I helped get the 40 put back together again, did a lot of work on it, literally put it together myself because they had their work on there, and they really didn't know anything about oil burners. That's the unique thing about the Durango and Silverton now. They're learning all about oil burning now. I remember back then we lit that locomotive up, the first oil burning locomotive down in the Durango and Silverton, and the guys were terrified because there was all these stories about these oil burning locomotives are dangerous and they have firebox explosions. Yeah, they do. You know, that happens from time to time. So we steamed that thing up and we took it on a break-in run, and I have the distinction of running the first oil burner down on the DNS. And we ran that number 40 at Georgetown Loop, probably 30 miles an hour, up through the valley, heading up. We turned to Rockwood and came back. I mean, it's just an absolute blast. So then that really set me up for just loving steam locomotives, loving all things railroad. But now I'm working on the main line. And that's a full-time job, obviously. You're working around the clock, you're called on all different hours, you're working at different schedules. One day you're in the yard, next day you're hostling, next day you're going to Pueblo, the next day you're on, you're just all over the map. And you get a tremendous amount of experience very quickly. My time books, I'm very, very glad that I was disciplined to fill out every single month. I filled out these really detailed time books. The train, the loads, empties, tons, the crew, the time we were called, all the little details, and some of them, some colorful comments at the bottom about a smart aleck yardmaster, about the dispatcher here, or about some other technical problem. But it's a window into the past that's important, and I share these stories with some of my coworkers and some people that are really somewhat, in the railroad industry, there's a lot to be concerned about. And I tell them, look, I got a time book that shows the same thing was going on 30 years ago. Just relax. But in those times, all the different things that we did and all the different things that I was able to do, there was still one thing missing from my life. So I started to build my own little railroad. And I built a 15-inch gauge along with Ted Schulte. Everybody know Ted? Ted's a fabulous modeler and a tremendous craftsman, very talented individual. And I needed some way to get this creative energies of welding and machining and fabricating and working with my hands. And we talked about building a railroad all the time. We talked about building locomotives and rebuilding things, but who can afford that? So the next best thing was for me to build a miniature railroad. So I invested a lot of my hard-earned money and many, many years of my life building this 5-inch scale Rio Golden Railroad at Heritage Square. Went out and bought a 25-pound rail and worked with Marlon Urich out at Urich Locomotive. He gave me the raw castings and I made all the parts and couplers. Oh, it was absolutely the time of my life. So now next thing you know, I get a call one day. They need an engine crew to help run the Canadian Pacific locomotive up in Canada. The Canadians, back in 1999, began restoring a 464 Canadian Hudson. And they were running it, they'd run it a little bit, and they were going to run, so this would be May 2004, they're going to run this steam locomotive from Vancouver all the way to Montreal. And they need somebody who knows steam locomotives and who's a certified locomotive engineer. So I'm asking the superintendent if I can have a leave of absence. Individual's name was John Schultz, steam locomotive aficionado. The stars are just lining up very nicely. And we were shorthanded in Denver. They wouldn't even let you take a day off. And he gives me a 90-day leave of absence. And I got to go up and help them run that locomotive. That in itself was some of the most interesting and enjoyable experiences, firing that locomotive. A lot of people talk about being an engineer and how cool it is. You get to blow the whistle, waving at everybody. You're the human figure in the cab window. But a locomotive fireman is really a very skilled position, and it's made to look easy by those that do it properly. But it is not easy. It's a very difficult art. And it's usually the result of years of a long apprenticeship and understanding the machine. You're not just sitting up there manipulating levers, you're burning the fuel, whether it's a coal burner or an oil burner. And there's a nuance and a feel. Some people have it, some people struggle with it. Other people just take to it, they adapt to it. That's how Ted Schulte is. I knew Ted Schulte would be a great fireman. So I spent many months, and it evolved into going up there multiple times until 2008. Right about then, they began to discontinue their steam program. But over the years that I was up there, again, taking 2 weeks here and there, take some vacation, formally take a leave of absence, go help them out. I've been over just about all of the Canadian Pacific, been up to Edmonton, been down to Lethbridge, over Crow's Nest Pass, through Overfield, through the Mackinac Tunnel, through the Mount Macdonald Tunnel several times. Just really a fascinating place over there. So then about that time, there was an opportunity for me to join the UP steam crew. And you'd think about dying and going to heaven, or winning the lottery. My friend Ed Gerlitz used to buy lottery tickets, and he loved that. And he would sit around, I used to kid him all the time, and say, oh, it's just a fantasy, you're never gonna win the lottery. Well, he didn't care, he didn't want to deal with my negativity. So I'd meet him at the coffee shop, and he would have written down on a napkin all the things he was going to do with the lottery. And that began years worth of this conversation, fantasy if you will, about what you're gonna do. And he would tell me, he goes, all right, the lottery is so and so. It's so many millions in the Powerball. What are you gonna do with it? And we began to kick around all these different ideas. It usually involved Rio Grande steam. Somewhere in that there's a Tennessee Pass tunnel. And I know there's a 3600 in there, or there's a 1600, and we just pretend like there really was. All right, we're going to take these millions and we're going to restore this 3600. I have in my office the headlight, whistle, bell, and class lights from the 3614. 14 is a unique number. I like shooting. My favorite rifle is the M14. My favorite Moffett Malley is the 214. Long before the 4014 ever came into my life. So we used to think and talk about all those things, and it prepared my mind for what it would be like. How would you do it? What kind of a team of people would you put together? Where would you start? What would you do? How would you go about doing a big project like that? So I was able to take my experiences on the main line, running the actual train, and then running steam locomotives, then running steam locomotives in another country, learning their rule book, and it's almost like a foreign language. Luckily for me, when I hired out on the railroad, we still had the older rule books, and we transitioned just a few years later in what we know as the General Code of Operating Rules. Well, the Canadians have the CRO law, Canadian Rail Operating Rules. And it's ironically exactly like our old rules. Nowadays, it'd probably be hard for me to learn all that stuff. But back then, I was a little bit younger, and I was like a sponge. So I took all these different rules tests and had all these different licenses, and was having the time of my life. Well, Brent, are we ready for your little?
So I'm gonna walk. We gotta switch and put on the projector.
Okay, we're gonna slip a little bit, and I've got some Rio Grande slides I want to show you.
I hopefully got it in the right order, yeah.
If not, you won't know it because I'll pretend that it's in the right order. That's how all my presentations are. I shuffle the slides.
We're gonna be even more low tech because you're gonna have to tell me next slide.
Okay. So in the course of working as an engineer on the SP, there are so many different opportunities when you get called to work. I've been on what we call the West Local, and back then we had GP40s or GP30 locomotives. I mean, think about that. A GP30 is from 1962, and the Rio Grande was still running, and that's my logo. Rio Grande Scenic Line. The Heritage Route, Heritage Square, that's actually one of my cars. And that's handmade by Ted and I. So how many people happen to know about that little railroad? It was a little bit of a, kind of an obscure little place up there. But it's all made, all handmade, it's 5-inch scale. And my goal was, is if you were to take a picture of the car without any people standing next to it, you wouldn't be able to tell it was a miniature railroad. All right, I mentioned 1600 in Tennessee Pass. So before I die, I'm going to make one of these in 15-inch gauge. And had I not started working on the steam crew, I probably would have had it done by now. But working on the steam crew, I've had to shift all my energies and focus to that. But I'm sure everyone's familiar with the M75. It's an absolute beast of a machine. And we'll zip back to that M75 real quick. The M75s were built at a time in the 1920s when the railroad needed more. It's no different than today. We need more. We want to haul longer trains with less locomotives. We want everything that we do. We're stretching the efficiency, we're stretching fuel economy, we're stretching the strength of the couplers. Every aspect of railroading is being stretched. Well, it was no different 100 years ago. They had the 1500s, the M67s, they were tremendous locomotives in the end. What were the 1500s here? I'm losing my... What were they? You had the M78s, and then what were the other ones?
M67.
M67, yeah.
67.
So here they were. The UP was developing the 9000s. The UP got into the 3-cylinder. That was the next evolutionary step in power development. The articulated locomotives weren't working out that good. The compounds were slow. They hadn't really breached that envelope where they developed the Challenger class, the high-speed, 4-cylinder, simple articulated locomotives. So this was the next logical step. So the guys that were involved in the unions, the guys that were involved in the labor organizations, the Master Mechanics Association, anybody that had any knowledge of locomotives said, why are you doing that? It's taken us years to get you away from having valve gear down in between the frames. And you finally got it out to where we could work on it, where the engineers can inspect it and lubricate it. We can see it. You're taking a step back. This is crazy. They did it anyway, and despite a few problems, initially when they deployed these machines, they were absolutely astounding in the power they developed and how they handled a train. Starting a train on the Great Tennessee Pass, Soldier Summit, heading up Palmer Lake. I mean, they just blew everything away. Well, in my mind, I'm captivated by this technological advancement. Different from the Union Pacific design. The Union Pacific used what we call the Gresley valve gear. I'm going to get a little technical on that. The guy that was involved as the chief mechanical officer, Arthur Feathers, was friends with Mr. Gresley. And they allowed Alco exclusive rights to use that design. Baldwin couldn't use that, so they had to come up with their own design. You can't see it in this photograph, but there's 2 sets of valve gear. Imagine that. What kind of an 8-beater that thing looked like going down the track. And that's what I want to build. That's the same reaction I get every time I do it. So I'm down at work one day, and there's a friend of mine who's a locomotive engineer, another farmer. But on the railroad, you got to be a closet farmer. I'm the only outward farmer there. Well, this guy was at work in the late 80s, and they were cleaning out some engineering offices on the top floor there at North Yard, and they had one of those tubes coming out of the window going down to a dumpster. And they had people that had no connection to the railroad, wheelbarrowing, just junk everything into these dumpsters. drawings. You can't imagine the beautiful archives that were trashed. He gets out of his car, going to work, he sees this dumpster, goes over, looks in, there's all these locomotive blueprints. He pulls one out, you know what it was? So I have the erection drawing for this, and I blew it up to Kinko's, and it's as long as this wall. And in my off time, I would hand draw. It's another one of my interests. CAD is beautiful, and we do amazing things with CAD, but I really enjoy hand drawing. So I have, not all of them, but I have a lot of the big hardcore drawings on them. So more to come on that. Stay tuned. If I win the lottery, definitely.
I see two circles. Is that like two piston valves?
Yep.
To the left of the big main, no, in the center.
That's a valve.
That's a
Cylinder.
right. Is there?
Cylinder valve. Cylinder valve.
Oh, okay. There's not two valve cylinders.
There's three. Yep. So here's one cylinder. Here's another one. Here's the third one.
Right.
So
a valve here. One. Is there two there?
And there's two on this side.
Oh, there's two on that side.
Two on that side. Yeah. The Union Pacific 9000s, they were designed with the valve chest had to be in the same horizontal plane,
Right.
because that valve gear operates the center valve off of the outer two valves, called a conjugating lever. And they have a syncopated beat because the center cylinder has a shorter stroke. These, they are all the same. So if you look at the geometry of the design, they're all 180 degrees apart, and it's all symmetrical, aside from the slight cant. So these, to my knowledge, there's no recordings of these in existence, and anyone who had anything to do with them is long past. Back in the 90s, I was able to reach out to a few people that remembered them, and they were in the mechanical department, so they didn't have favorable things to say, because they are hard to work on. But when they were brand new, they were enormous. 75,000 pound tractive effort, and the weight on drivers per axle is more than our modern locomotives. Our modern locomotives are running around 70,000. That was 75,000. So these things really crush the track. Now we're going to go back. Here's my 15-inch gauge locomotive. My handmade snowplow, my little coupler. I had to be practical because it's one thing to have a hobby, it's another thing to have a hobby that's so big. I'm not independently wealthy, I didn't win the lottery, but I'm determined to make this cool railroad. That means I gotta turn it into a business, which means it's gotta make some money, and it did. So this is what I used in the interim. This locomotive, the core machine, was built by a friend of mine, and I modified it extensively. I put new wheels on it, completely did it. I wanted to make it look more like a Rio Grande, kind of like that number 50. I never got to put the side rods on it yet, but this locomotive's still out running out in Strasburg on the Thane Family Railroad. But I had a nice shop up in there and was able to do all types of welding, some limited machining, and really had a lot of fun up there. But you can see the Rio Grande influence there.
I'm sorry. Did you? Okay.
There we go. So that's one of my cars. And aside from the little door latches here, you really can't tell that's not a 3-foot gauge car, other than the fact it looks straight and clean, it's not warped, and you know, the narrow gauge fleet, really, a wooden car takes a beating. I've got some stories with my friend who was a fireman on the narrow gauge in the 50s, and he tells some great stories. You know, there were some engineers off of the Rio Grande Southern that were terrified of what they called the big engines, the 480s and the 490s. He was used to the RGS, those smaller engines. And they would double head sometimes. And there was one time he was called as a fireman for this individual. And I'll say his name, Pinky Linton. And he was a great old engineer, but he was really uncomfortable with the big engines. And there was another pair of individuals, they were brothers, they called them the Wrecking Crew. They were cousins or something, Holt and Hardy. And these two guys would get on a train and they'd end up tearing a car in half or something would go wrong. Because they were just aggressive. Running fast on 3-foot gauge track with those big giant, for all intents and purposes, standard gauge locomotives with the wheels pressed in. So he tells a story one time, he's the fireman, And they've got a 490 and a 480, and they're in their helper, which is the engine in front, and he's shoveling coal, and they're coming up 480 hill, and there's a few of those little sags, and Holt was on the road engine, and he never shut the throttle off. And the way Ed tells the story, it sounded like that engine was going to come through the tinder. Because think about that. Here's the tinder, and there's the smoke box, and you can see the smokestack right behind you. And old Pinky Linton's up front, closing the throttle a little bit more, because they're going pretty fast, getting a run for the next hill. And he's leaning his arm out the window, giving this slow down, slow down, slow down. Because you can't put the brakes on effectively. I mean, you obviously could, but you'd completely mess up the works. But that was a funny story. Oftentimes they would break those idler cars in half during the pipe campaigns. You know, that the Rio Grande did what they needed to do to press as many cars in service to handle that volume. Kind of the last hurrah on the narrow gauge. And my friend Ed was there to witness it as a fireman. All right, let's slip into the next one here. Now these are boards that I have. Those are boards that I have as I took the cars apart and I've rebuilt them. Those are just handmade stencils. I just always loved that flying Rio Grande. You know, when I was a little kid, 5 and 6 years old, you'd watch the fast freights of the Rio Grande come rolling through Arvada. We'd go up on a picnic up to Tolan and East Portal. And that font, that logo always captivated my mind, my imagination. And the next slide here, 1995. We still have the bars light, we've got ditch lights. I'm on a set of helpers, and we got the last little bit of miles out of the tunnel motors, and I'm stopped just east of Tunnel 3. And because you're the engineer, you can stop where you want, right? It was such a unique railroad, and even still today, when you know dispatchers, and that's one of the things that's made railroading fun for me. It's not just come to work and just do your job kind of thing, and get to know the yard masters, you get to know the quarter managers, the dispatchers. And I was just back, I was invited to attend a special ceremony the Cato Model Company made N-Scale 4014, and I was invited to attend a special ceremony with our chief executive, Jim Benna, and our executive vice president of operations, Eric Geringer. So when you know people, you get to know the dispatchers, you get to know the quarter managers, you get to do a lot of neat things. They call you by your name instead of Rio Grande 5405. Hey Ed, the dispatcher calls you up for 5405, and then the next thing is, hey Ed, can you do this? Hey, what do you think about this? It really has been an absolute fun journey. So there I am wearing my Rio Grande hat with my military boots. I can't believe that they're letting me do this. And on that fateful day, I was able to run the last set of GP30s through the Moffat Tunnel in 1995. I was called off the extra board to work the West Local, and the conductor, who's been retired about maybe close to 6-7 years now, his name's Merle Stanberg. This is Jim Sprouse, he's a brakeman. He ended up moving on, doing something else, but he was a great singer. I remember he'd be singing in the cab as we were going along. And you know, just gung-ho times, but this is at Hot Sulphur Springs. So we get our work done out at Western Aggregate at the Rocky Flat Spur. The dispatcher calls us up, and figuratively speaking, the dispatcher has his hat in his hand because he's going to ask you to do something that you don't have to do. As a local crew, you don't really have to go, but I need somebody to go pick up these cars. Okay, where are they at? Moment, just a quick pause. They're in Kremlin. And I'm like, oh yeah. And the conductor's like, well, you want to go to Kremlin? I'm like, yeah, let's go. So we're going to take these from milepost 18 all the way up to the tunnel district, through the Moffat Tunnel, down to Winter Park, Tabernash, Hot Sulphur Springs, through Byers Canyon, through Flat, through Troublesome, and go to Kremlin. Pick up the cars, lickety-split, and then come back home again. One of the other things that I admit that I enjoy is the old Nathan M3 horns. Well, this had an M3 horn. Anybody familiar with those?
Yep.
They have a very unique sound, a very pleasant sound. The horns on today's locomotives, there's some interesting horns they have. Our USD 70AHs, those EMDs, they have a very melodious, a very distinct horn. The C45 fleet, they more or less don't. It's kind of a blah horn. These, you can play music like a steam locomotive whistle in a way. It's the next best thing. If you can't have a steam locomotive whistle, have an M5 or an M3 or more. So there we are, and I'm very, very happy that I had a camera with me, and you always look back and want to take more pictures. Like, gosh, I could have taken more pictures. We stopped in the Moffat Tunnel. If I did it once, I did it a dozen times to take pictures of that apex sign. There's this really cool cat eye apex sign in the middle. All kinds of other little artifacts in there. You just stop, take a look at them. Dispatchers wonder what happened. They never called me, you know. But it was just a blast. And there's another shot, that's Merle and I. And so you can see the SPAC fleet that's just coming on board. That was another fascinating time to be a part of that. A lot of the older generation, just like today, it's hard to embrace change. When you grow up with something, it's all you know. It's hard to embrace some newfangled gadget. You know, it just is. They were computerized, alternating current, what the heck does that mean? So I was so gung-ho, and I admit this, and I mean this with the utmost respect, the railroad doesn't always give you what you need to do the job. They really intend to, but somehow it doesn't really, you don't always get the operator manual. I had to steal one. There was a whole stack of them. I don't know why they just weren't handing them out. And I went in there and so here I am going down the road reading this, and it was a really intense manual. So next thing you know, I'm running these ACs, and you're learning all these little tricks about them. I get called on a train one day. Again, no training. Nobody's there to show you how to do it. You're the engineer. So on the old days, when we had manned helpers before the DPs, first out engineer is the helper. The second engineer is the road engine. So if you're first out, you're in the pool, you get to go ride the second engine. There's going to be 5 tunnel motors, maybe 6, and you're going to ride the second engine. You're going to deadhead. The guy who's second out, he's got to run the empties up to the mine. When you're rested and the empties are loaded and you're going to come home, first out gets the helper. He's got to run on the head end. You get to be back in the swing helper. So they call me to take this train, and I ask them, well, who's the helper? Oh, you don't have a helper. And I'm thinking, well, is it the Valmont? Because the Valmont was a shorter train. Sometimes you didn't have a helper. No, it was the Dixon train. Well, you better call a helper. Nope, there's no helper. All right, what am I going to argue with them? I get down there, and it's one of the first DP trains that we ran. And they certified the sets of those locomotives to DP only with those other locomotives. Today, they're interoperable. They'll DP with anybody. Norfolk Southern, KCS, CP, UP, BN, doesn't matter. Back then, it was so new, and the system was not integrated. That means that it's not inside the computer itself. It's not an embedded part of the software. You have this little green box up there. And there was a guy from G.E. Harris to show me how to plug all that stuff in, but he didn't know anything about running the train. Let me talk about fun. Because right away, I mean, you just pretty much figure it out on your own, and you're off and running. And next thing you know, you become the resident expert on running helpers and DP and doing all this cool stuff. But it was just a blast. You can probably hear the enthusiasm in my voice. So here we are, fast forward to the year 2018, and this is the 3006 that had been preserved along with some other equipment. And thank goodness that it was preserved. And there was a series of other events, and the UP needed the property at Burnham to be vacated. And I get a call one day from an individual that I knew in the real estate department, and I'm thinking, why is he calling me? So we talked for a little bit, and he starts to tell me the story. And there had been a long discussion about these locomotives and some other equipment, but we got to get it out of there. We're going to scrap it. And I'm thinking, scrap it? What are you talking? You can't scrap this stuff. Well, progress. Time moves on. We can't save everything. It pains me to say those words. You can't save everything. Well, you darn well better try. So, fortunately, in my role at that time, I had been the manager of the STEAM program since 2010. I knew how to get things done. We moved the big boy back. We did all kinds of other little projects in the interim years, and there's processes that you follow. And in the role that I'm in, you have tasking authority to do certain things. You get approvals for things, clearly, you follow a process, but they told me that this equipment was old and you can't run it on its own wheels. With all due respect to somebody in other departments, I'm an operating person. Why can't you run it on its wheels? What's wrong with it? So I go down and take a look at it. It's got roller bearings, for goodness sakes. I'm like, well, surely this thing's got to roll on its own wheels. And I shared with them, and that's what you do, is you help build understanding of what you need to do. It's not that you're going to just disregard the comment that it won't move. Well, your duty is to help them understand why it can move. This is easy to move. It had air brake issues. It sat there for years and years. So step one is you reach out to the Federal Railroad Administration and you ask them. It's a formal process. I write a letter and I'm asking them to grant me relief on some of the requirements that this thing has to meet a lot of different regulatory stuff to move down the track. We're only going to move it to this museum here. If I can make it move safe and it can have a few little basic safety things on it, yeah, go ahead and move it. Again, it's a formal process. Check that off the list. Well, the caboose, that's easy. Well, there was this old derrick. Let's see if we can get to that picture.
Oh, there's at the end. I put all the 30s.
So here, I'll just talk about this for a minute. Here's Ted Schulte there, who is another classic faller. If he was here right now, I'd have seen face palm. But Ted loves it just as much as me. So we were able to work with the Forney Museum, and we moved all of their equipment out with UP switch crews, with UP locomotives. This is the benevolent, very friendly Union Pacific Railroad is going to come in and give you this equipment for free. And I get to be responsible for that and dot all the I's and cross all the T's and work with the museum. So we've already moved the rotary snowplow out. Let me get to the next picture here. There's Ted. He doesn't want you to take his picture. Look at it. But he wasn't quick enough, was he? So Ted was having the time of his life too. So there's the UP switch crew. Now that's a fun day when you show up to work and you get to interact with the crew. I know most of them. And I'm like, well, we're going to have an interesting day today. And you job brief them on what we're going to do. We're going to take this equipment out. We're going to go down to Burnham and we're going to pick it up and we're going to run it over here. And we're going to go through the BN yard. And we're going to take it up here. And, it's just an absolute blast. So I snapped these pictures as you go, documenting this process.
That's the last one.
Okay. Well, I think we have a few in there, but this is a classic signal at Tabernash. Those signals have been replaced. Talk about progress and time marching on. But that was the Rio Grande as I knew it, the Southern Pacific. And I did what I could to capture all these unique locations. So somebody that doesn't really into the railroad hardware, that's just like a traffic light. But those were installed in nearly 100 years ago. And it was a fascinating development in the modernization of the Rio Grande. There we go. Now we're talking about this unique steam derrick. It's a 120-ton derrick. Denver and Salt Lake. This is the 10300. There's pictures of this up on the loop trestle, almost tipping over. I don't know the backstory, but you can see the guys inside holding on. They had the outriggers out, but something happened, and they had that boom extended, a load shifted or something, and it almost went on its side. When this last came from the Salt Lake area. Again, it was preserved. It went to the scrapyard. Someone bought it to preserve it. Another individual bought it, preserved it, transported it to Burnham with some other equipment that was being preserved. Because the boom was extended a little bit too high, it couldn't go through the Moffat Tunnel. Well, at the time when I was asked to help see if we could save the equipment, the company had already initiated some dialogue with the museum in Granby, the Moffat Railroad Museum, but how to get it there. And there were discussions about trucking it and taking it apart, and I just figured, well, it's going to get scrapped because they don't have the ability to do that. It's so cost prohibitive. It's roller bearing, it's been up and down the Moffat countless times, but it hasn't operated for years, and the mechanism to physically lower the boom it's going to require a lot of work. So I hired this crane company to come out and simply pick the boom up, I cut the cable, lowered it down, and I did all this work myself. That was part of the behind the scenes piece of this. I was given permission by my boss to work on this equipment as long as I didn't charge, as long as there wasn't any impact on my budget. So I went down there on the weekends, I went down there at night. Here's my company truck, there's my dad standing there taking a picture. And I worked on this stuff. I took one of my other guys, we did some air brake work, and it needed quite a lot of work. But that was the challenge of making that happen, is to lower that boom down so it would fit through the Moffat Tunnel. And here we are. We actually moved it for the one last trip, 75 miles. We had a crew of 2 individuals, 2 big modern AC locomotives, and we traveled 25 miles an hour. Myself and Ted actually rode in the boom car. So we went along to make sure everything went with no issues, no problems. The FRA gave us what's known as an OTM, a one-time move authority, and that grants us relief from all the regulatory requirements. It still has to be done safe, you still have to have functioning air brakes and so forth. But we were able to move this locomotive on its own wheels all the way. And I wish I could share the videos with you, they just don't play well on these type of devices. But I've got videos going in the Moffat Tunnel, up through the Big Ten, up through Tunnel 1, I've maxed out my space on my phone. So there it resides at Granby, and they've got plans to continue to restore that and other things they're working to get. But it was just an effort to try to find a way to not let this equipment get scrapped. You know, when you think about what it means to destroy, to scrap, if you've ever seen big equipment getting scrapped, it's very brutal, it's very heartless, and you literally disassemble it and melt it down into something else. Well, I didn't want that to happen. So forgive me, these are a little bit jumbled up here, but here we are just lifting the boom up, and it's a really quick, simple operation. So the first time, in who knows how many decades, that boom moves up, and the cables go slack, and I had it all worked out. I used a zip saw, I cut the cables, and I looped them back through themselves and fastened it back around the hoist on the drum, and then lowered it back down again so it was low enough. We had a bunch of old trucks and some other things that we moved off the table. And there we are, just getting ready to go in the Moffat Tunnel, watching that big hook, that's what they call the main hoist, the big hook gently swaying going down the track. You know, watching that 120 ton derrick, thinking about the Moffat Malleys that pulled it, the 100s, you know, the Moffat Hogs, how many times that had been over Corona Pass. And it was modernized. It still had the original arch bar truck, but it was modified with a roller bearing conversion in the arch bar truck, the neatest looking arrangement. And they were Class F bearings, which are pretty darn good size. And it was just the neatest thing. You know, when we moved it out of Burnham the first time, just no matter how much you clean it, the same thing happened with the big boy when we moved it for the first time. You know, dust and debris kind of comes out of every place. And it's just neat watching it come back to life again. You see the rusty wheels, which haven't turned in decades. And then here they are turning. You lubricate things and you adjust things and you continue to lubricate it and work with it. and you make it work, and then it's rolling down the track just like it always has. It's very satisfying. And there we are, we staged it at the Forney Museum, and here we are with the big modern locomotive. We're getting ready to take that. And here's the crew that was helping me. There's Ted, and there's a local switch crew there that was with us. And we're going to stage that locomotive, and we're going to take it up, and we put together what we call an operations wire. Anytime we move any special equipment, a special passenger train, an executive train, it's the same process. And I put together this movement authority which lays out how this move will fit into the plan of the network. And from there they assign locomotives and call crews and all the things that you need to do. And in running the steam locomotive, there's a lot of nuance. With the big boy, it's so large, that's a dimensional load, it's a very heavy load, so there's an entire other realm of things that we do to make that work. That was off somebody's Facebook post, can you tell? Here we are coming on the Coal Creek Viaduct. This used to be a bridge back in the Denver, Northwestern, and Pacific days. Yeah, that was a fun trip. It was a beautiful day. Moving the caboose out of Burnham. The Rio Grande made those cabooses in their shop there at Burnham. And again, I could not bear the thought of a Rio Grande caboose being scrapped. That just was unheard of. So that is now resides at the Forney Museum along with that GP30.
That's it?
And that's it. Well, I have a whole lot of pictures about the big boy. And I know I like to talk about the Rio Grande, and I was just curious if anybody would like to see a few pictures of the big boy, or if you have any questions about anything I've talked about. And then if you have any questions, what I can do is I can refer to a presentation that I have, and I'll really quickly go through and find the picture that will answer your question about the big boy. Sir?
I was in Cheyenne yesterday. It looks like there's some 1400 series old Rio Grande cabooses there.
Yes.
What are they doing with those?
Well, that's over the years, as I've seen them throughout the system, I will have them come to Cheyenne. I'll create some dialogue with whoever has them and route them to Cheyenne for preservation. You know, just hang on to them. So
Thank you.
we don't have any plans for them, but they're more or less in safekeeping. Whereas in other locations, they could get scrapped. With a big organization, equipment gets scrapped every day, and oftentimes without real regard to what that equipment is. You know, there's been times within the last few years we've had baggage cars, beautiful, pristine baggage cars that just get cut off. You know, there's an order to get rid of this stuff, but when the contractor comes in, it's gone. Big 250-ton derrick, gone. And I'm like, oh no. So that's what I'm doing. Any other questions? Sir?
The steam crane was the 029.
Yeah.
Was that the one that was based at Roper Yard?
I believe, yeah, Roper was on one of the assignments. It was based in Denver. It served all over the network. Being 120.
I spent a lot of time, I hired out pretty bad, spent a lot of time at Roper, and I was thinking, is that the one that was in Roper? I was wondering, who owned it? How did it end up in Burnham?
It was purchased by a group of individuals that were putting together a museum, and they had acquired a lot of really cool Rio Grande equipment, and were gathering it and storing it, and they had an agreement with the railroad to store it at Burnham. And I wasn't involved in any of that process. I got involved once a lot of that disposition stuff had taken place. But the 120-ton derricks, it seems like a lot, but they weren't really heavy enough. The 150s and then later the 200s and the 250s were really necessary. On a mountain railroad like the Rio Grande, when we have derailments in our world today, we generally, the locomotive derrick has been, in some cases, replaced by the side boom cat. You know, They arrive at the derailment site via flatbed truck. These companies specialize in derailments, and that's all they do. So the railroad has gotten away from having the internal capacity to re-rail equipment in that manner. That's another story when you've got a locomotive down in the canyon. And just before I hired out of the railroad, we had a fatal accident where the 3010 and the 3115 and an SP motor were destroyed. They hit a rock there at tunnel 26. And the only way you can really handle those big locomotive projects is with a derrick like that. They've got a really short turning radius, the tail swing is short where they can fit in a canyon wall. So there is a need for them. The big 250 tons, several of which are still stored throughout the system. We had to call one out last winter on Donner Pass when one of the rotary snowplows derailed. But it's fewer circumstances where they'll be utilized. If you've ever watched Holscher re-rail equipment, those machines are reversible. We used them when we lifted the big boy to take the front engine out and to put it back in. So the versatility of those machines is hard to beat. So that's where you've seen a lot of these smaller machines fall by the wayside. The Rio Grande kept them serviceable into the 80s. You know, there were people that were familiar with the steam boiler and could run them, could fire them, and people could run the hoist. You know, it's all manual. It's nothing hydraulic. It's not a modern piece of equipment. It is a steam engine and a steam hoist with old brakes and a steam boiler, diesel fuel. I mean, it is really a fascinating piece of equipment.
Were you ever involved in a ski train?
Yes, I ran the ski train dozens of times. I'd get called off the extra board. That was a blast of a train to run. When we ran it in the days with the GP60s, I did not run the old ski train. That was gone. When I hired out, we ran the ski train a lot, and that was just a blast for me. It was old railroading. It was like running a train on the narrow gauge, but you're running it on the standard gauge. You know, the way that you handle the air brakes, the dynamic brakes of those GP60s, the 3,800 horsepower GP60, we'd usually have 3 of them. When I'd get called and I'd show up down there, they had 3 of them, I was like, oh yeah. If you had 2 of them, it was going to be fine, but with 3 of them, you could put people back in their seats. And I would pride myself on getting there. We were doing it at 9:15, I could get you there at 9:06. You know, and I was just like, you ever see the movie Emperor of the North? I didn't have a hammer and I wasn't yelling at people. But I was running that ski train in the old-fashioned way. The dispatchers would get everybody out of your way, and you'd come out of that Union Station, you talk to the operator at 31st Street, you cross over there at the CNS crossing, and then we're on the Rio Grande. You got a green there at Prospect, and I'd go by North Yard at 45, slow down over the Diamond at CNS, or at Utah Junction, 25, right up to Arvada you'd go. And back in the days, we'd run passenger train speed. So you can run, where you can run 25, you can run 28, where you can run 30, you can run 33. You know, all those deep nuances.
So we're running over already. I know you have the whole other slide deck. Is there one or two, I mean really one or two, because we're quite late, that you'd like to hit?
Can you say starting with the Rio Grande or Southern Pacific?
Rio Grande.
So this is my crew. This is when we got back from our double heading. So I've talked about the narrow gauge, I've talked about the Rio Grande, and so I become involved with the crew. In 2004, they asked me to become the manager in 2010, and there's a very long story. I could talk for hours about that process. But the opportunity to restore a big boy, talk about winning the lottery, how would you do it, what would you do, all those things, well that literally is dumped in my lap. And the decision was left to me. Are we going to restore the 3985? Or are we going to restore a 4000? And the senior vice president asked me, he goes, which one do you want? We're not going to get rid of the 844. We can only have 2. And the discussion from an executive decision-making standpoint, why do we have a steam locomotive? Some would ask. Others might ask, that's great, it's wonderful we have the steam locomotives. Others will ask, why do we have two? Selling two isn't always as easy as we as rail fans would want it to be. Three?
Forget it.
So which one do you want? Well, it's clear which one I chose. And the reason for that is the return on investment. As magnificent as the Challenger class, UP had 105 of those, the Rio Grande, those were my favorite Challengers, 3700s. I'm going to build one of those after I build the 1600. But the Rio Grande Challengers were fabulous. During the war production board made the Rio Grande take 5 UP Challengers. And as the rumors, as the stories go down through the ages, the UP guys didn't really like them. Theirs were better. But the Challenger is a fascinating locomotive, a magnificent engine. There's only 2 left in the world. Well, there's 8 big boys, but none of them are running. And for years, the world was told that the big boy would never run. And people can quote people telling them that the big boys can't run, they won't, it's impossible, etc. So we can spend 5 or 6 million completely rebuilding the big boy, the 3985, which was my strategy, that was my plan. And I got the money for that. And then this opportunity presented itself, so we simply shifted, we pivoted, and it was nothing than scratching out 3985 and writing in 4014. From an accounting standpoint, very simple. But the process in itself was just a magnificent story. We had to do extensive work on this locomotive to make sure it was safe to run again. So that took some time out of the 5 years I wanted to spend on that. And we took the big boy completely apart, 2.5 years, and put it back together again. And if you ever have a chance to come to Depot Days or some of the open houses that we have, I can talk to Brent and maybe we could have maybe a tour of the organization at some time, if that would work out. But if you get to see the big boy, you can see all the hard work and effort that we put into it. So there you go.
Ed, thank you very much. So the plan now is to go from the sublime to the ridiculous. We're going to have the Board of Trustees come up here and take your questions. And we can talk about any, you got Jeff and company will be up here and you can ask them anything about the future, next year, the year after, next, whatever's on your mind. And once you're tired of that, we'll organize carpools and get ready for the morning layout tour. Sound good?
And I just took a video from my YouTube channel, is that okay?
Sure.
Here's my, eventually I'll have it uploaded.
Oh, great.
Was this your I'm sure you know Bernie Watts, right? And I got something on the other side also.
It is Sunday afternoon, August 28th, 2023, at the annual convention of the Rio Grande Modeling and Historical Society at the Doubletree by Hilton in Aurora, Colorado. That was Union Pacific Railroad's head of the heritage operations, head of the big boy operations, head of steam locomotives, Ed Dickens, addressing us, talking about his career starting with the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad and then Southern Pacific and Union Pacific. Again, Sunday afternoon, August 28th. Again, saw us Sunday afternoon, August 28th, 2023, Aurora, Colorado, over and out.